Hello, everybody. I'm John Lassey. Today I'm going to be talking about one particular Mayflower passenger, John Howland. I chose to talk about John because he's my 9th great-grandfather, or rather, he's one of them. Theoretically, if you do the math, I could have as many as 1,024 9th great-grandfathers. I say theoretically because in all probability the number is somewhat smaller. Given that the population in the area of Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts was relatively small, the chances that cousins might marry cousins in succeeding generations would be fairly high. Consequently, I could have several different ancestral lines leading back to John Howland and his wife, who was another Mayflower passenger, Elizabeth Tilley. Elizabeth was the daughter of Mayflower passenger John Tilley and his wife Joan, both of whom died in early 1621 during the first winter in America. John Howland's primary claim to fame is that he came within an inch of losing his life on the voyage across the Atlantic. During a particularly bad storm, John fell overboard. He had the good fortune and presence of mind to grab a rope and hang on long enough to be pulled back aboard. Most of what we know about John, and in fact about the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and the early days of Plymouth Colony, comes from William Bradford, the second governor of the colony. His record, later published as Of Plymouth Plantation, 1620 to 1647, is the principal source of information concerning the people and events of that time. His first mention of John Howland concerns his rescue from a watery grave. In sundry of these storms, the winds were so fierce and the seas so high as they could not bear a knot of sail, but were forced to hull for divers days together. That is, take in most of the sails and drift with the storm. And in one of them, as they thus lay at Hull, in a mighty storm, a lusty young man, called John Howland, coming upon some occasion above the gratings, was with a seal of the ship, that's meaning a pitch or a roll, thrown into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards, which hung overboard, and ran out at length. Yet he held his hold, though he was sundry fathoms under water, till he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and then with a boat hook and other means got into the ship again, and his life saved. And though he was something ill with it, yet he lived many years after, and became a profitable member, both in church and commonwealth. Bradford's use of the term lusty to describe Howland likely does not have any sexual connotation, but probably means lively or merry, although since John and Elizabeth had 10 children after their marriage in 1624, we can't be entirely sure of that. Not much is known of John's early life. We know that he was the son of Henry and Margaret Howland of Fenstanton in Huntingdonshire, which is just a little northwest of Cambridge, England. Here it is on a contemporary map downloaded from, rather contemporary nowadays, downloaded from Google Maps. He is believed to have been born around 1592, but the only evidence we have for this is a notation in the Plymouth Colony records regarding the date of his death, which was recorded as February 23rd, 1672, and which indicates his age at above 80 years. Some sources, however, say that this age was exaggerated. John's date of death is usually given as February 23rd, 1672/73. I'll explain that shortly. It's somewhat complicated. The girl John eventually married, Elizabeth Tilley, was born about 1607, a little further to the south and west in Henlow, Bedfordshire. John had two brothers, Henry and Arthur, who emigrated to New England after he did. They were not Puritans like John, but were Quakers who settled in what is now Marshfield, Massachusetts. At this point, I think it would be appropriate to explain a few things about the calendar and dates in England and its colonies in the 1600s. Until 1582, the Western world measured time using a calendar authorized by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE. Not surprisingly, it was called the Julian Calendar. Under this calendar, a year was considered to be exactly 365 and a quarter days long. As with our current calendar, 3 out of every 4 years were deemed to have 365 days, with every 4th year or leap year having 366 days. In 730 AD, or CE in modern usage, it stands for the Common Era, Saint Bede the Venerable of the Kingdom of Northumbria is credited with discovering that the Julian calendar year was 11 minutes and 14 seconds too long when compared with the actual length of time it takes the Earth to go around the sun. But it took over 800 years before Pope Gregory XIII brought the calendar into sync with astronomical observations by dropping 10 days between October 4th and October 15th, 1582. The practice of adding 1 day every 4th year was kept, but was fine-tuned by providing that 3 out of 4 years, evenly divisible by 100, that is, the last years of the centuries, would be ordinary years of 365 days, with only every 4th centesimal year, that is, a year divisible by 400, being considered a leap year. Within a couple of years, most countries in continental Europe, the Catholic ones anyway, were using the new Gregorian calendar. However, Britain and her colonies, which had stopped paying attention to the Pope long before 1582, continued to use the Julian calendar until 1752. In that year, the government of the United Kingdom under George II adopted the Gregorian calendar and decreed that the day after September 2nd, 1752 would be advanced to September 14th, a loss of 11 days, thus bringing the calendar into sync with the rest of Europe. Perhaps more importantly for genealogists, in England prior to 1752, the end of each year was midnight, March 24th, rather than December 31st. For example, March 24th, 1700 was followed by March 25th, 1701. When Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar, New Year's Day was changed to January 1st. In order to minimize confusion arising from this change, for pre-1752 dates falling between January 1st and March 25th, genealogists generally indicate both years separated by a virgule. It's more commonly known as a slash. That's why John Howland's date of death is usually expressed as February 23rd, 1672/73, or sometimes just 1672/3. Without this practice, It's easy to imagine situations where people can become mixed up as to the correct order of events. For example, if the date a person executes a will is given as November 1692, but the date of death is given as January 3rd, 1692, as opposed to January 3rd, 1692/93, a researcher might tend to question the validity of the information. So let's get back to John Howland. Although we don't know much really about his early life, we do know that when he traveled to New England on the Mayflower, he did so as the indentured servant of John Carver. Carver was one of the prominent men among the separatists, as the Pilgrims were known. In fact, he was selected to be the first governor of the colony. The Pilgrims were called separatists because they believed they should worship separately from the Anglican Church, the state religion of England. Although John Howland has been described as an indentured servant, he probably wasn't of the menial fetch and carry sort. Unlike many young Englishmen of that era, he had some education. A number of books were listed among his possessions, and some sources indicate that he acted as Carver's personal secretary and right-hand man. Indentured servitude was quite common in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's been estimated that as many as 1/2 to 2/3 of the immigrants to the New World were under contract of indenture. It was a device particularly used by people of limited means in order to pay their passage across the Atlantic Ocean. This next slide shows an example of a typical contract of indenture during that era. This contract appears to have been dated in 1766. It illustrates for me how common the practice must have been back in the day. It's a pre-printed form which people could acquire and then simply fill in the blanks, with or without the aid of an attorney. It reminds me of the forms for standard leases or bills of sale you can buy nowadays at an office supply store. Generally, the period of servitude was stated in the contract. Typically, the period would run 4 to 7 years. During the period of servitude, the master was responsible for housing, food, clothing, and other necessities of life. At the end of the period of servitude, the master would typically provide the former servants with the means to get a start in his or her new life of freedom, a grubstake, if you will. Sometimes this took the form of land, sometimes money or other gifts. Other than the fact that he fell off the boat, we don't know much about how John Howland fared during the voyage of the Mayflower across the Atlantic. The voyage was long and difficult, and accommodations for the passengers were crowded and uncomfortable. We can probably assume that John, as their servant, was kept busy assisting the Carver family. By the time of the storm, which caused Howland to fall overboard, one can only imagine how squalid and smelly the passenger accommodations below decks had become. That may have been the reason why John felt the need to venture topside. The Mayflower's company had expected to settle in Virginia. After their arrival off the coast of Cape Cod, however, they realized that they were too far north. Initially, they tried to sail further south, but found the passage at about that time of year, November, to be too dangerous to attempt. Further, their supplies were running low, so they returned to Cape Cod Bay, anchoring near what is now Provincetown. Not all of the passengers on the Mayflower were separatists. Some of these folks, who were referred to as strangers by the separatists, began to get restive and claim that since they were not going to end up in Virginia as they had agreed, they had no obligations to remain part of the group. To counter this mini-rebellion, the separatist leaders decided that they couldn't continue to remain disorganized, but needed to start forming a structured society. Accordingly, they drafted a document which has come to be known as the Mayflower Compact. John Carver has been credited with drafting it. This slide depicts the signing of the compact on November 11th, 1620. According to the wording, the 41 passengers who signed it agreed to solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. John Howland was the 13th signer. By early in the next month, December 1620, the leadership, believing it necessary to find a permanent site for their colony before winter set in, formed a small group of the men to accomplish that. John Howland and Governor Carver were among those chosen as part of the group. Using a small combination sailboat and rowboat, called a shallop, which they had brought disassembled with them from England, the group set out to explore the western and northern shore of Cape Cod in order to find a permanent site. This is a modern map of Cape Cod Bay, showing the site of the Mayflower's anchorage near what is now Provincetown. I've added a picture showing a replica of the shallop in Plymouth Harbor. Alongside is a replica of the Mayflower's longboat. The group did not have very far to go before they ran into problems. Since their arrival in Cape Cod Bay some weeks earlier, the Pilgrims had discovered a number of caches of food set aside for the winter by the local Indian tribes, and took some of it to add to their own dwindling food supplies. Since winter was coming on, it may be assumed that this created a potential hardship for the native population. When the small band of explorers landed on a beach near what is now Eastham, Massachusetts, they were set upon by some very determined and angry Indians, who shot volleys of arrows at them, forcing them to return fire with their rather unwieldy matchlocks. Although the Pilgrims did not lose any men in the encounter, they determined that it would not be practical to choose a permanent site on the Cape, given the hostility of the locals. Instead, they moved further west to the mainland, to what is the present site of Plymouth, Massachusetts. After landing on the shore, they discovered the remains of an Indian village. The scattered bones left behind told the story of a devastating disease that had wiped out the previous inhabitants. With what I would describe as rampant Eurocentrism, the Pilgrims took this as a sign from God that they were meant to settle in that location. In other words, they assumed that God had conveniently wiped out all of the Indians for them. I guess this was not an uncommon attitude for the times. This is the present-day museum, Plymouth Plantation, now renamed Plymouth Pawtuxet, to acknowledge the original Wampanoag Indian village located on the site. After the main body started developing the site at Plymouth, efforts were made to establish friendly relations with the Wampanoags, who lived in the area. As Governor Carver's secretary, Howland can be presumed to have had a hand in negotiating with Massasoit, the tribe's sachem. These negotiations led to the establishment of a treaty of friendship and mutual support with the Wampanoags, which lasted for over 50 years until King Philip's War in the 1670s. The first winter in New England was a tough one for the Pilgrims. The Europeans were simply not prepared for the hardships of a New England winter, particularly as they had barely begun constructing enough buildings to shelter the colonists. Approximately 1/2 of the colonists did not survive. As I mentioned earlier, John Tilley and his wife Joan were among those who perished that winter. Their daughter Elizabeth was taken in by the Carvers. In the spring of 1621, Governor Carver died. A few weeks later, he was followed by his wife, Catherine. The death of his master left John Howland a free man. Since the Carvers' children had died before the Mayflower left England, Howland is thought to have inherited at least some of the Carver estate. When Governor Carver died, William Bradford became governor of the colony. John began to acquire land and became increasingly prosperous. He married Elizabeth in 1624 when he was in his early 30s, and she was approximately 16 years old. He continued to be regarded as one of the solid citizens of the colony on whom Governor Bradford relied. When the Mayflower expedition was being planned in 1620, it was financed in part by a group of London so-called merchant adventurers. In exchange for financing the expedition, the colonists were to pay a substantial percentage of the profits expected from fisheries and fur trading. By 1626, the London merchant adventurers had disbanded. John Howland, along with John Alden and 6 others, agreed to assume the debt of the colony with the London financiers. In return for doing so, these 8 people were given a monopoly in fur trading rights with Indians along the coast as far as north as Maine. Within a few years after thus acquiring fur trading rights, the colony had established the Cushnock trading post in what is now Augusta, Maine, on the Kennebec River. You can visit the site of the trading post today in Augusta. In 1634, this was the site of a bloody altercation. Howland and his crew were out on the river near the post when they discovered a man by the name of Hocking, who was from New Hampshire on the Piscataqua River, and he was trying to horn in on their territory in violation of what they believed to be their exclusive trading rights. Howland ordered a couple of his men to cut the anchor cable on Hocking's boat so that he would drift downriver out to sea. Howland's men found the current to be too strong for them to accomplish this, so Howland sent another man named Moses Talbot to help them. When Talbot seized Hocking's anchor cable and started to cut it, Hocking put a gun to his head. Howland then shouted at Hocking to stop, even offering himself as the target. But Hocking went ahead and shot Talbot anyway, killing him. As soon as he did so, one of Howland's men shot Hocking in the head and killed him as well. Because of the incident, Alden, not Howland, was briefly detained in a Boston jail until Governor Bradford interceded and was able to obtain his release. There is no record of Howland ever being either charged or punished for Hocking's death. In fact, he went on to become one of the leaders of the colony. He held a number of offices in the Plymouth colony at various times, including selectman, assistant and deputy governor, surveyor of highways, member of the Fur Committee, and deputy for Plymouth to the Plymouth Colony General Court. As I said before, he died a respected member of the community on February 23rd, 1672/73. Here's a picture of his tombstone in Plymouth, Massachusetts. This is how it reads. Here ended the pilgrimage of John Howland, who died February 23rd, 1672/3, aged above 80 years. He married Elizabeth, daughter of John Tilley, who came with him in the Mayflower, December 1620. From them are descended numerous posterity. He was a godly man and an ancient professor in the ways of Christ. He was one of the first comers into this land and was the last man that was left of those that came over in the ship called the Mayflower that lived in Plymouth. One thing on the tombstone may not be accurate. Howland was not the last of the Mayflower pilgrims to die, as he was outlived by at least 5 others, including John Alden. But John Alden had moved on to found Duxbury, Massachusetts, where he died there in 1687. So perhaps the inscription on the tombstone referred only to men who died in Plymouth. Elizabeth also outlived John. She lived another 15 years and died in 1687, also at the age of 80. Of course, as with any couple who leave descendants, the story does not end with them. John and Elizabeth's oldest daughter, Desire Howland, from whom I'm descended, was the first of their 10 children. In the next generation, John and Elizabeth had 88 grandchildren. Although I believe that John Alden and Priscilla Mullins are credited with having the most descendants of any of the Mayflower passengers, John and Elizabeth Howland, with an estimated 2 million descendants, can't be far behind. Desire Howland married Captain John Gorham. Before he was killed in King Philip's War, the two of them had 11 children. The Gorham's eldest daughter, from whom I'm descended, also named Desire. She and her husband, John Haas, had 12 children, and so on and so on. When I think about John Howland, what strikes me and makes his life intensely interesting is that it very graphically illustrates how sometimes a matter of split seconds can have a profound effect on the course of history. It's kind of reminiscent of the movie with Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life. Had John not had the presence of mind to grab that rope when he fell off of the Mayflower, or if his reflexes had been a bit slower, I wouldn't be here today, nor would any of my children. And of course, none of those other 2 million descendants would have been born either. As I list some of them, be thinking about how the world might have been different if they had never lived. Here are some of these folks. Franklin D. Roosevelt. I don't think I can reasonably claim to have had a profound effect on the course of history myself. However, the same cannot be said for our 32nd president. Can you imagine how World War II would have turned out without FDR? Our 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, is another descendant of John and Elizabeth. The Cold War might have ended anyway had someone else been president of the United States in 1989, but it's doubtful whether the events surrounding the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent reunification of Germany and dissolution of the Soviet Union would have been managed as well. Of course, Bush 41's 2 sons, George W. and Jeb Bush, are also descendants of John and Elizabeth. Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder of the Mormon Church, is another notable descendant. The history of the Western United States would probably have been quite a bit different without the Mormons. Perhaps less well known is Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts. He was one of the founding fathers. He served as a Massachusetts delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and frequently acted as chairman of the convention's Committee of the Whole. He also served as a member of the convention's 5-man Committee of Detail, which was tasked with the responsibility of drafting a written document incorporating and structuring all of the decisions made during the first 2 months of the convention. Dr. Benjamin Spock. His book, Baby and Child Care, first published in 1946, was one of the best-selling volumes in history had a profound influence on how children of my generation and afterward were cared for and brought up. I can't count the number of times Kathy and I consulted the book when we were raising our children. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, author of the epic poems Hiawatha and Evangeline, and one of the most celebrated poets in American history, was also descended from John and Elizabeth. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson is next on the list. He served as Attorney General under Franklin Roosevelt. I wonder if they knew they were cousins. Until he was appointed to the Supreme Court, where he served from 1941 until his death in 1954. He took a leave of absence from the court in 1945 to act as Chief United States Prosecutor at the International Tribunal in Nuremberg, which tried the principal leaders following the end of World War II. Essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century and leader of the American Transcendentalist movement, was another descendant. And let's not leave out another Howland descendant shown in this picture, Humphrey Bogart. He's the one holding the gun for those of you who are not moviegoers. If it weren't for him, Victor Laszlo and Ilse Lund, the couple on the left, would never have been able to take the plane to Lisbon to escape the Nazis in Casablanca. That's all I have. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Goodbye.